President Trump just tested positive for coronavirus. Holy. That's crazy. Oh my gosh. The President of the United States, of arguably the most powerful and influential nation in the world, has just tested positive for the coronavirus, a virus that is notoriously negatively affecting the elderly population. President Trump is, of course, the oldest president in U.S. history. Now, of course, he is relatively, I'll say, not showing his age as much as other old presidents we've had, but nonetheless, his biological age, or his chronological age, is such that he is very, very old. Do you guys know that conspiracy theory about how every president elected in a year that's divisible by 20 has died in office? So this was, oh gosh, I think it started in 1840. 1840, you had President Harding. 1860, you had President Lincoln. Then you had 1880, President Garfield. Then you had 1900, where you had McKinley. All four of them died in office. The latter three were assassinated. It was only the first one that died. Then in 1920 and 1940, you had Harding and then Roosevelt, who both later died in office. And then back in the 1960s, we got back to assassinating people because that was hip again, and we lost JFK. Now, that theory, or that old conspiracy, has since faded a little bit, because in 1880, Ronald Reagan had an assassination attempt, but he did not, in fact, die in office. And in 2000, George Bush had a shoot thrown at him. So, who knows? Maybe the person who gets elected this 2020 will die in office and will continue that trend. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, but I find it an interesting historical fact, which is interesting. Now, let's go into detail. If President Trump dies, what's going to happen? There really isn't a precedent for this, but the obvious assumption will be if he dies before Election Day, he will be struck from the record as a candidate. If that were to happen, the Republican Party would probably throw forth someone. They would spit out some decently viable Republican candidate who has done zero campaigning and has done basically nothing in the national spotlight, just for the sake of saving face, to show that they are still the Republican Party and that they are active, and to give their hardcore voters something to vote for. However, the most reasonable outcome would be that Joe Biden would be the clear winner by a landslide, because no matter how good the candidate is that the Republican Party throws forward, it's unlikely that candidate had any plans to become president, or at least this fast. And even a candidate that is opposite the majority of Republican people's beliefs, Joe Biden, would be a better viable candidate on that front, where he is at least up to date on the hot button issues. Option two, what happens if President Trump dies after Election Day? So the first option is he loses the election to Joe Biden, but then he dies after that. Now, this has happened in history. This happened once before in history. In history, it was the election of 1872. You had Ulysses S. Grant versus Horace Greeley. Now, Ulysses S. Grant was the landslide winner at the time. Everybody loved him. He was a war hero. He was very knowledgeable. I believe Charles Dickens once referred to him as the most brilliant man he ever knew. He's a brilliant man. And if you ever want a great read his autobiography or one of his books. Now, he swept the floor. There were 37 or 38 states in the Union at the time, and he got 31 of them. He was the clear winner. He swept the floor. But right after Election Day is early November, in late November, November 29th, Horace Greeley died. This was before the faithless electors, based on the Electoral College system, had gotten together to actually cast the votes to decide the winner. The popular vote had occurred. Election Day had occurred, but the winner had not been decided because the faithless electors had not done their job, or had not convened together. Because keep in mind, this was a long time ago. People traveled by horse and buggy. America was a big country. But they had not met together. So when this happened, when news broke that Horace Greeley had died, even though he had lost the election, the faithless electors still had to cast a vote. And so that was the only time in U.S. history where more than one faithless elector did not vote as per the vote of their people. Now, they didn't have the choice, of course, but that was a very interesting time. And so what they did is they didn't like Grant, even though he was the only candidate in the election at that point with any viability. They still voted for a bunch of third-party candidates. There were 4 alternative presidents and 8 alternative vice president candidates. And so they just all split their votes up and divvied them up to those people, just as a show of spite. So maybe that will happen this year, where President Trump loses the election, but just to spite Joe Biden, all of the faithless electors from Republican states or states that voted Republican will then vote for a random assortment of third-party candidates. So you might see some interesting news headlines of candidates who you didn't even know were running or existed receiving like 4, 5, 10 votes, which could be a very interesting thing. Now, option number 3, President Trump wins the election, but then dies very quickly thereafter. If that happens, then conspiracy theory is true. Every president elected in a year that is divisible by 20, starting in the 1840s, has or will have died in office. Yeah, I just wanted to rant about this. I've been meaning to start like a daily video series for the last couple days, and some sort of a vlog or education thing where I teach stuff or talk about stuff, and this just happened and I couldn't waste the opportunity. The United States president tested positive for coronavirus, and regardless of whether you agree with that person or disagree with that person, that is national headlines, that is international headlines, and I think that's really cool. And we get to be here and watch this happen. I mean, history is going to be made, or could very well be made, if the coronavirus negatively affects President Trump. And whether that's it incapacitates him for a while, some people have spent a few months in a hospital, or whether that actually brings about his death. Those will be national headlines. Those will be very major events, and I'm very interested to see what happens.